We release this treatment to that perfect law, knowing so certainly it is done, that we say together, and so it is. Alrighty, everyone. Well, thank you for being with us. This week we're still working from Dr. Frederick Bale's book, Your Mind Can Heal You, which is a classic in the field of healing. And what we want to kind of look at some of the ideas that we've gone over from both Bales and Trine, and we want to understand today, we want to talk about faith. Now this topic of faith is going to span more than just one Sunday. In fact, it probably spans 52 Sundays over and over and over again. Because this is ultimately what our life is about, what our spiritual growth is about. It is about increasing faith. But we have to understand what faith is, and we have to understand what does increasing faith mean. And ultimately we have to understand that we individually can do it. It doesn't do me any good to know that you increase your faith. I have to be able to increase mine if it's going to do me any good. You increasing your faith will do you good, but it won't do me much good. See? So we have to know that not only does this thing called faith exist, and that it can be increased, but that I personally can increase my faith. And then I can start to see the results. So that's sort of where we're going today, and it'll spill over into next week when we get into specific techniques. Today we're going to kind of talk about, in general, the process by which faith is developed. What is faith, and the process by which it is developed, why it is important. And then next week we're going to go into the specific techniques that we use in our spiritual practice, right? So think of our spiritual practice in several ways. You remember a few weeks ago we talked about the importance of being aware of the processes that we refer to as thought. You know, we say, I have a thought, or something, I had an idea, or something came to my mind. Now, we don't understand entirely those processes. We all share, as human beings, we share the experience. When we share it well enough to say, oh, I had an idea, and everybody else knows what that means to have an idea. Now, it may mean something different to everyone, but everyone has a general agreement, or some understanding, kind of a collective, unspoken agreement that when somebody says, I have an idea, we all nod our heads and go, oh, yes, yes, I know what that means. We don't really know what that means, but we're familiar with it. It is very familiar to us. It is part of us. But we don't always pay attention to what that activity in our field of consciousness is. It is there. It is going on. It is going on at a level of which we are consciously aware, and it is also going on at a level below conscious awareness, call it the subliminal level, right? So there's things that are going on, they might call it the subconscious level. There are things going on of which we are not aware. And those things, a lot of it is emotion, those things determine the actions that we take in our life. This is what mindfulness, the mindfulness movement, is about. That the way that you and I think, the way that we behave, the way that we act, is greatly influenced by the way that we are reacting to thoughts, ideas, and emotions that are taking place below our level of conscious awareness. And if we wish to change the experience that we're having in the outside world, we have to change what's going on in the inside world. And then we have to become aware of what's going on in the inside world. We must become mindful of all that is going on within our total being, right? Many times when you take training classes in work and things like that at church, they'll give you the iceberg, and they'll say, you know, what consciousness is like an iceberg. 10% is above the surface, and we can see it, but 90% is below the surface, and we can't see it. But that 90% is forming, supporting the part that you see. So on our Zoom group, which we're meeting Thursday, by the way, for anyone who wants to join us, excuse me, we're meeting this Thursday and again for 5 weeks. But we've been watching a series of videos in a documentary called The Century of the Self by Adam Curtis. We're going to be on part 3 this week. But the basic premise that the filmmaker started with was he was drawing off of the work of Freud. And the part that he asserts, what he says is that Freud came to the realization that human beings are motivated by subconscious beliefs and desires and emotions that they don't understand. So we do something and we think we understand why we did it. You know, as when I was learning to sell, we were taught, you know, people do not want because they have reasons. They have reasons because they want, which means they have some type of a desire, and then they justify that. They find reasons that kind of satisfy the intellect. Well, this is why we did. This is why I did this. This is why, you know, this is why I want that particular car or that particular house or that candy bar or whatever. So Freud came up. I don't think he was the first one, but he certainly made popular the idea that human beings are motivated by things that we don't understand, things that go on below our level of consciousness. And then the rest of the series kind of goes into then how other people have taken that theory and come up with ways to use it to influence people to do whatever the influencer wanted without the people really being aware that they've been influenced, you know. Marketing, for example, sales. Why do people want to buy a certain product? You know, those kind of things. And then kind of more importantly, how politicians kind of work with that and can use it to manipulate the masses, if you will, to get the masses to do what the politicians wanted them to do. So it's very interesting. Now, you may or may not agree with the premise, but the reason that I think it's important is that there's a lot going on within us that we are not aware of. But we have the ability to become aware of. Human beings may be self-aware. We may not be self-aware. It is a choice, and it is something that we deliberately must do. Right? This is why we have to go for things like mindfulness training. This is why we have to learn things like meditation, to observe the activity of thought as it passes through our field of consciousness. And eventually we learn through our spiritual practice, we learn that we do not have to react. We do not have to respond to every thought or every emotion that arises within our field of consciousness. Right? And this is again is very important, because just at a practical human level, it's very important, because how many times do you hear people say, "Well, I didn't have any choice but to do that. I didn't have a choice. I had to respond that way. They said a bad thing about me, and I had to punch them in the nose because that's the right thing to do." And when we learn that thoughts occur and emotions occur, and there's all kinds of things going on, but we do not have to react and respond to them. We have a choice as to whether we engage them. Then we can break out of this cycle of manipulation, whether we are being manipulated by our own past beliefs, by our own experiences, by our own upbringing, you know, whatever situations we lived through as we were growing up, or whether we are being deliberately influenced by people who are trying to manipulate us to do what they want to do. We don't have to engage. We don't have to engage. This is a big, important step in maturity of consciousness. This is a big, important step in becoming the chooser, the speaker, as the Kabbalah might call it, the chooser of our life. I refer to it as the CEO of our life. We are the ones that are accountable for what we react and respond to. We are accountable for what we allow to influence us. But as human beings, in general, we spend very, very little time observing, very little time being the witness, very little time doing the very one thing that we can do to set ourselves apart, to take that giant step forward on our spiritual path. So this is sort of very important. It fits right into what we're talking about now with faith, because once we started to get into the discussion of faith and how our cells are built in our bodies and how things happen with physically within us, we start to understand that even if there were no spiritual power, if there's, even if we were to say, I don't believe it's a spiritual universe, but the thoughts, the emotions, the things that are taking place in consciousness, not only what I am consciously aware of, but what I am conscious of but not aware of, the subliminal, all of these things have an effect on the development of our bodies. And we gave examples of that, how we blush when we're embarrassed, and we didn't think, well, I'm going to make my cheeks turn red now, I'm going to do something to cause the the blood vessels in my cheeks to swell up, I'm going to do something to make my breath shallower. We don't think of that at a conscious level. It happens automatically as a result of what we felt. So there can be no doubt, right? There can be no doubt that what we are thinking and feeling produces physical changes in our bodies. And then Dr. Bales went on and he showed us how over time, he gave us an example of someone who came to him for counseling. And the gentleman was crippled up with arthritis. He could not walk. And he had gone through all kinds of medical treatment. They took his tonsils out. They removed all the fillings from his teeth. They did all kinds of things to try to eliminate a physical or mechanical cause for what was going on. And in working with this individual, Dr. Bales found out that what happened was this man's sister-in-law moved into the same town he lived in, about a mile away. And his wife decided on Sunday afternoon that every Sunday afternoon they were going to go for a walk over to her sister's house. And he didn't want to do that. He resented having to do that. Now, he didn't say to himself, I've got a plan. What I'll do is I will cripple up my body with arthritis so I don't have to go. But nevertheless, that's what happened to him. Right? So long-term thoughts of resentment, long-term thoughts of a desire, I don't want to have to walk over there. All these kind of things over time played out. And what Bale says is that within 2 months of working with this man, the symptoms were gone. The symptoms were gone. It was something within his belief system, in his consciousness. Something in there was affecting the chemicals in his body, and it resulted in disease. And there's a couple important things there. It took time, or it didn't happen overnight. It took time for the man to get sick, but the healing was relatively quick compared to the amount of time it took for him to become so sick he couldn't walk. But he was not thinking specifically about that disease. And this is so important. I hear people say that all the time. Well, if it's done unto us according to our belief, and I've come down with such and such a disease, I wasn't thinking about that disease. You don't have to be thinking about that disease. Are you thinking about what you're thinking about? That's the important question. And most of the time, we will say, well, no, I'm not thinking about what I'm thinking about. I get up in the morning, the clock radio goes off, I turn on the coffee pot, I get dressed, shower, I jump in the car, excuse me, and then I go to work and I'm busy. But we're not taking that time to think about what is going on. What do I believe? What is belief? What is faith? Where did my faith come from? Whatever faith I might have, we all have faith in something. Can I change what I have faith in? Can I change my belief system? So this is why it's important, is what we experience in life is an outpicturing of the totality of what we believe. The totality of what we believe. That's another important point Dr. Holmes brings us to. Sometimes when we're working with illness, people will say, well, I want to know exactly what idea I have that produced this disease in my life. Because if I can't find that idea, if I can't go in there and find that particular idea and remove it surgically, like a surgeon would take out an appendix, go in there and just make a little slit and go in there and just grab that little appendix and remove it. People want to go into their consciousness and remove that particular idea. And Dr. Holmes says you're never going to find that particular idea. You're never going to find it, because it is the totality. It is a combination of things, combination of many different beliefs, a combination of many different experiences. And what the important thing to do is to pay attention to what's going in now. What are you allowing into your consciousness now? And as you allow, I will say, a higher quality of thought, for lack of a better way to explain it. If you will allow in thoughts that are more in tune with, more in harmony with the perfection of the divine, that those will displace the ideas of negativity, the ideas of resentment, the ideas of fear, and the ideas of doubt. Holmes gives us the example of a glass of pure water into which we drop ink. And the ink diffuses, and the whole glass of water takes on a tint. If you put blue ink in there, the whole glass of water takes on a blue tint. He says you can't go in there and you can't reach in there with your hand and you can't pull out that blue. But if you put that glass of water under a tap and you slowly let clear water back into the glass, over time the clear water will have flushed out all of the blue water. Over time the glass of water will return to its former state, its natural purity. I'm getting some water here. So I bring these things back because it is very important for us, even if just on a psychological level, but more importantly so on a spiritual level, because the spiritual level says there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. It is done unto you according to your belief. So even if we didn't want to think about that power, we would say, well, gee, if what I'm thinking and what I'm believing has a physical effect on my body, then it would be in my own best interest to pay attention to what I'm thinking, to pay attention to what I'm believing, and to make sure that I am deliberately letting pure water into the glass, so that it might flush out everything that is unlike itself. In the Four Agreements, Don Miguel tells us, he says, if you do not disagree with something, if you hear something and you do not disagree with it, you have silently agreed. You have silently agreed. And I think that's very important, because we hear so many things. All day long we will hear people tell us things that we really don't believe. And what we do, we don't go to them and say you're wrong. That's a great way. That's a great way to lose friends and create enemies. But we silently say to ourselves, that may be their truth, but I don't accept that for myself as my truth. I don't accept that for myself as my truth. So something very simple. Somebody says, well, I left the window of the car down a crack and a damp breeze came in and it gave me a cold. Well, that's their truth. That is what they are believing. But I don't believe that every time I leave the window down a crack, I'm going to get a cold. I don't accept that. So what we're doing is we are paying attention to what we are giving our attention to. Now, what does all this have to do with faith? You remember Baal said that we are created in the image and likeness of the divine, and we have a spiritual nature that is perfect, whole, and complete. But we have been created as individuals, and we are having a human experience, and in that human experience, the experience is less than perfect, whole, and complete. And the reason for that is that the human side has not yet fully connected with the spiritual side. And Bales tells us that it is our thought that makes the bridge. The perfection of God is already here. But if we are not connected to it, if we have not identified with it, if we are not consciously, to use Ralph Waldo Trine's example that we talked about a month ago, if we are not consciously opening that valve, that water gate, to allow the fresh influx of divine into our lives, if we have restricted the flow and the activity of the divine in our lives, then our experience is less than perfect, whole, and complete. Another example I used was the curtain on the window, or you can even think of nighttime. The sun is still shining at night. The sun is still shining even when you have all your curtains pulled tight and the room is completely dark. There's nothing wrong with the sun. But what has happened is we have put ourselves in the shadow, either by pulling the curtains or because the earth has rotated in such a manner that we at night are in the shadow of the earth. Sun is fine. Sun is still shining. But we are in the shadow. And all that has to happen for the sunlight to appear in its fullness is for us to remove ourselves from the shadow, to open that curtain, or perhaps to put it in biblical terms, to rend the veil. In the old temples, the innermost part was the Holy of Holies. This is where the tabernacle was. This is where the very presence of God was believed to be. And it was surrounded by a very thick curtain. Dr. Rocco Errico tells us it was very thick. It was like 4 inches thick. I don't know how he knows that, but that's what he says. So in the New Testament, we are told of the rending of the veil. At the moment Jesus died on the cross, there was a rending of the veil. The separation between God and man that was represented by the veil was, was gone. You and I have to do that individually. We have to rend that veil. We have to remove any barrier, any block, any boundary that exists only in our consciousness that somehow separates us from the perfection that is there. This is the essential idea. Now, faith is the highest quality of that thought that connects us. So we need to understand what faith is. We need to understand a little bit about how we get it. We need to understand a little bit about how we change it. And then we need a specific technique, which we're going to go into next week, the specific techniques of how we go about this. Excuse me. So the first thing that we want to consider is the definition that we are using here of faith, right? Because there's all kinds of different ideas of what faith is and how we acquire it. And so in the popular opinion, like in the world as we see it, perhaps in the churches that we grew up in, faith was something that did not logically or intellectually make sense. In fact, it was usually something that did not make any sense whatsoever, but we were told you have to accept that because it's a matter of faith. It's an article of faith. It's something that you just have to believe because somebody tells you to believe it. At least that was my understanding. That may not be everybody's understanding, but that's the way I took it as a child growing up. There were some things that just, there was no explaining, that don't make sense at all, but you just have to believe them. I remember one example that was given as we were kids growing up was the idea of the Trinity. How can God be three people in one person? This, how can there be three people but one person? This was kind of an oxymoron. It just doesn't make sense. How could that be? And we were trying to understand that, and the teachers were trying to explain that to us. Well, this is what we believe. This is an article of faith. This is the doctrine of the Trinity. That there are three separate persons, but there's only one God. So the story that we were told to kind of get us to stop worrying about that was that there was this saint, this very holy man, this very deep thinker who wanted to understand the Trinity and made it his business, that this was his life's work. He was going to understand the Trinity. And he would go out and he would stroll along a trail, and he would walk along this trail that wound around a lake, and he would contemplate this mystery of the Trinity, and how could this possibly be? And along the way he saw a little boy, and the little boy had dug a hole in the sand, and he had a bucket. Reminds me of the story I told you about my grandson at the beach. And the little boy was taking the bucket and dipping it in the lake and pouring the water into the hole. And this great thinker, this holy man, said to him, "What are you doing?" And the boy said, "I'm emptying the lake into this hole." And he went and he got another bucket of water and he poured it into the hole. And the man says, "Well, that's ridiculous." He said, "It's impossible for you with that bucket and that hole, it's impossible for you to bail that lake out and empty it into that hole." And the boy, who was an angel in disguise, says, "And it's just as impossible for you to understand the Trinity. You have to believe it." So we were told that, and in retrospect, I kind of look back and say, this was a way of teaching us, saying, well, you're never going to understand it with your intellect, so don't even think about it. Just accept it. And that was my understanding of faith as a child growing up. Believing in something that really doesn't seem to be any reason to believe in, but believing it because it's faith. So I say that because that's not the definition of faith that Frederick Bales and Ernest Holmes are using. That is not. So maybe we need a different word so that we don't get confused with our old definition. So maybe we just want to say certainty. Certainty. A knowing so certain that any idea to the opposite cannot enter the mind. Certainty. Now, if that's the definition that we are using, are you certain about anything? Is there anything in your life of which you are certain? And I think everybody would have to say, well, yeah, there are things in my life of which I'm certain, absolutely. And I would say, well, how did you develop that certainty? Why is there certainty? What process did you use to develop that certainty? Did you sit out one day and say, I want to develop certainty that gravity holds me to the surface of the planet? And you didn't. You didn't, you see. It came from your experience. It came from your observation. It came from your very living. And what Bales tells us is that the faith is a result of the knowing. You didn't have to scrunch up your eyes and go into a trance and fast for several days and do all sorts of things. Deprive yourself of sleep and do all the different things that people do to try to build faith. You didn't have to do any of that to come to a knowing so certainly that the idea that you would just fly one day off the surface of the earth could not possibly enter your mind. You get up every morning, you wake up, you're still laying in the same bed that you fell asleep in. Most of the time. Sometimes we roll out. You stand up. You have to push against gravity to stand up. You have to get dressed. You have to move against gravity to get dressed. You walk, and you have to expend energy to offset gravity as you walk. You go make the coffee, which is the miracle of the day, right? And gravity brings the water down through the coffee grounds for you. You go get in your car, you drive to work. You never worry. You never worry that the car is just going to float off the surface of the earth. You have an absolute certainty that gravity, you don't even have to think of gravity, but you have an absolute certainty that it is there. Excuse me. That it is there and that it is working and that it will always work. No doubt can enter your mind. That is what we were talking about when we were talking about faith. So then, how does that relate to, our physical body? How does it relate to our health, as Frederick Bales tells us? So he says we don't have to try to work up a faith. We don't have to try to whip it up. We don't have to try to get in a frenzy to develop this faith that our physical body is part of something magnificent. See, this is the other thing. We have to connect to that magnificence that is already there. But we have to know it. We have to know it certainly. And he says, we don't need to look any further than what is right before us in order to develop the knowledge that there is something magnificent going on. There's an intelligence, there's a divine intelligence at work in the physical universe of our bodies. While we are engaged in this conversation on a Sunday morning, how many billions of cells, new cells, come into existence in our physical bodies? And how many billions of old cells pass out of existence? There's a renewal that is going on, a constant renewal that is going on. And you and I never even think about it. But it is influenced by the quality, the totality of the quality of our consciousness, just like the man who developed the arthritis. They are influenced by the quality of our thoughts. Bales asks us to think of the miracle of the birth of a child. We have two cells, a sperm and an egg, and they come together and they make one, and the two become one, see? And then the one becomes two. And everything, every quality of the physical aspect of the life of that child is contained in that one little drop of jelly. Color of the hair, the color of the eyes, the tone of the voice, the height, the weight, all of those things. They are all contained there in this miraculous encoding system that we have learned to call DNA. It is there. And over time, the cells start to divide. The 2 become 4, the 4 become 8, the 8 becomes 16, and so on. And they become specialized, see? Some become so clear that we can see through them. They become our eyes. Some become so hard that there are bones and they support the rest of our body as we go through life on this earth. Some become specialized and they form organs, the heart, to pump the blood vessels through which the blood goes, the lungs that exchange the gases that are in our bloodstream for the gases that are in the air, the trees that give us the air that we breathe, and our lungs that give them back the air that they breathe. Bale says just contemplate that. Just contemplate that for a minute, and you will realize that there is an intelligence at work. Dr. Holmes tells us if you find an engine sitting out in the middle of a cornfield, you know that somebody built it. There was an engineer who designed it. The engine is the outpicturing of the intelligence of the designer. Every piece is thought through. Every piece is there for a purpose. There are no extras. There are none missing. And Bales tells us to think about that with the human body. The hinges of the elbows and the knees and the joints of our fingers. How does all of this attach? There's an intelligence at work there. There's a perfect intelligence. It is unfolding perfectly, intelligently. Bales tells us that the intelligence permeates the cells, so that scientists have taken human skin cells and kind of scraped them off of the surface of the skin and put them in a petri dish. And they immediately begin to link back up and try to form a solid patch, because that's what skin cells do. There's an intelligence within them that knows what to do, even when they are removed from the host body, you see. I was reading one time something that absolutely fascinated me, and it was about the termite mounds in Africa. Have you ever seen pictures of the plains in Africa? There's these huge mounds of the termites built, and some of them are built in an arch. So you can think of that, there's like two pedestals coming up from the ground, and then somewhere in the air they've joined together. And the author was saying that if for some reason that arch gets knocked down, the termites on either side immediately begin rebuilding the arch. Now, as far as we know, they're not talking to one another, They don't have transits and surveyors, instruments, and all those other things, but somehow the intelligence that exists within the individual termites, perhaps the collective intelligence of the mound, somehow they work for the same purpose. And the termites on either side of the arch rebuild the arch perfectly so that it meets back again. There's an intelligence at work there. There's something there that knows what it's doing. Even if it's functioning at a chemical level like the skin cells, there's an intelligence there that is outpicturing. And Bales asks us to consider that. And then he says we have to consider that the intelligence that got us all that way, and I love to think about the moment of birth, the moment of birth. While our little bodies are in the womb, we are not breathing air because there's no air there, but we're breathing in and out fluid. We don't need to get the oxygen from our lungs because we are getting oxygenated blood through the umbilical cord. So our lungs are developing themselves. They are moving in and out. They are bringing in fluid. They are expelling fluid. And this is training the muscles. Right? Those lungs are going to have to do that for the rest of our lives. And they're developing in there. They're developing for something that they haven't yet experienced. They're developing through some type of an intelligence that comes down through the DNA. So you can imagine now what happens to this little child whose lungs are full of fluid as it's born. And as the little baby rotates head down and starts to move down through the birth canal, right, in a manner that will present the nose and the mouth to the air that must be waiting, right? Think of that. The lungs developed to receive the air that was already there. Somehow they expected that. Somehow they knew that. But as our little bodies pass down the birth canal, our chests are squeezed tight, and all of that fluid is expelled. So that when our body passes through into the world, our little lungs pop open, and we draw in our first breath, there is a perfect intelligence at work there. And it doesn't leave us the moment we are born. If we cut our finger, we can watch the blood clot and the scab form, and eventually the scab falls off and the skin underneath has healed itself. So what Bales is telling us here is we want to contemplate these things, or whatever things we need to consider in order to arrive at the certainty that there is an intelligence at work. There is a perfect intelligence at work. And the quality of our thought affects that work, influences that work. So that every second of the day, as new cells are built into our bodies, what we want to be doing as we learn to develop our faith is we want to be creating that environment of health, that environment of perfection. We want them to be created in the image and likeness of the divine. Whatever you need to do, think about the things that you take for certain. Think about how you develop that certainty. And start to think about what, if anything, must you do to develop the certainty, the faith, that there's an intelligence at work in your body, right here and right now. I just want to give you this one example excuse me, that demonstrates how our beliefs can affect our physical performance. Right? As far back as the 1880s, the athletes who compete in track and field, they were chasing the holy grail of track and field, of long distance runners, to break the 4-minute mile. They wanted to be able to run a mile in less than 4 minutes, starting in the 1880s. And no one could do it. No one could do it. And there were people who said it is impossible to do it. It can't be done. The human body just simply can't move fast enough for that to be done. Other people said, well, maybe it can be done, but it can only be done on a day that meets certain conditions. It's got to be exactly 68 degrees. The track has to be hard clay. There needs to be a big crowd there to cheer the runner on. And if all of the conditions just come together just right, then perhaps it can be done. And people kept trying and people kept failing. And then in 1954, Roger Bannister, an English track and field athlete, he did it. He did it. Less than a second he shaved off of it. But Bannister became the first human being to break the 4-minute mile. A month later, the second human being broke the 4-minute mile. A year later, 3 runners in the same race broke the 4-minute mile. And if you look now at the record for the marathon, the New York City Marathon, is like 2 hours and 3 minutes for over 26 miles. The runner who completed that marathon in 2 hours and 3 minutes ran an average of 4.5 minutes per mile. Can you imagine that? So since the 1880s, they were chasing that holy grail. In 1954, Bannister achieved it. And once other people started to see that it could be done, you see, they had faith that it could be done. They were certain it could be done. It had been done. There was no reason for them not to do it. So if you want to develop faith and you're not certain how to go about it, find people who are doing it Read about people who are doing it. Study about people who are doing it. And vicariously, by seeing that they are doing it, then you will know that you too can do it. Excuse me. A certainty, a knowing so certain that no idea to the opposite can enter your mind. Excuse me. That is what we are developing. And most of the time we're not paying attention to what goes into our consciousness or what comes out of our consciousness. Most of the time we're just going along with race consciousness. This week, I invite you, think about what you believe. Think about what you believe. Is there a perfect intelligence operating within your body right now that is capable of creating every cell, every organ, every tissue, every function in perfect order? And it will do so perfectly as we create the avenue in consciousness that is in harmony with it. That is in harmony with it. If you've ever gone to a symphony orchestra, at the beginning you can hear the instruments trying to attune to one another. And I think it always starts with the oboe. That's the lowest note, and it's the hardest instrument to tune. So everybody else tunes to it. But you can kind of hear, you're sitting there in the audience and you kind of hear this low sound come out, and then everybody else starts to join in. You can hear all the other instruments joining in. Excuse me. And what they are doing is they are attuning themselves. They are getting in harmony with one another. And I invite you to consider this week that what your primary interest is tuning yourself to the perfection that already exists. In our affirmative prayer, we are not trying to coerce God or convince God or wear God down so that God will do something for us that God hasn't already done. We are trying to attune ourselves to the perfection that is already there. Are you certain that the perfection is there? If not, work on that. Are you certain that your thoughts can influence how that perfection appears in your life? If not, work on that. Next week, we will go into specific techniques to use to develop our faith that we can, in fact, influence the way that the physical nature in our bodies reacts and how to do that. So we'll talk to you again next week. Have a beautiful week. Pay attention to what you're paying attention to. Think about what you're thinking about. Take some time to be the witness.